I pretended to be a poor and naive mother the first time I met my future daughter-in-law's family, and within 30 minutes they told me everything I needed to know about them. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I was 68 years old at the time, a widow with silver hair, comfortable shoes, and a faded blue cardigan that had seen better days. At least, that was the version of me they were allowed to see. On a warm Saturday afternoon in Dallas, my son Daniel invited me to meet Ashley's parents for lunch at a country club restaurant. Daniel sounded excited on the phone. He believed he had found the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. As a mother, I wanted that for him. I also wanted to know the people who had raised her. Experience had taught me that family reveals itself in the smallest moments. So I arrived exactly as planned, driving my 12-year-old sedan instead of one of the newer vehicles sitting in my garage. When I stepped out of the car, I noticed Patricia Carter looking me up and down before I had even reached the entrance. Her smile appeared a second too late. "Margaret, it's so nice to finally meet you," she said. Her voice was sweet. Her eyes were not. Inside, the dining room smelled of fresh coffee and polished wood. Daniel stood and hugged me. Ashley greeted me warmly enough, but there was something nervous behind her smile. Richard Carter shook my hand. Brandon Carter barely looked away from his phone. The conversation started pleasantly. Weather, traffic, wedding ideas. Then Patricia asked what neighborhood I lived in. When I mentioned a modest area on the edge of town, she exchanged a quick glance with her husband. It lasted less than a second. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. A few minutes later, Brandon asked whether I was retired. I told him I was living on a fixed income and keeping life simple. "That must be hard these days," he said, though he sounded more curious than sympathetic. Patricia leaned forward. "Well, at least Daniel has a successful career. Young couples need stability." I smiled and nodded. The questions kept coming. Not about my interests. Not about my late husband. Not about family. Traditions. Only money. Expenses. Property. Savings. Every answer I gave seemed to disappoint them. By dessert, I felt as if I had been quietly measured and found lacking. Then Ashley excused herself and Patricia followed her toward the lobby. A few moments later, I stood to visit the restroom. As I passed a hallway near the entrance, I heard Patricia's voice. "At least she seems harmless," she said softly. "The important thing is that she won't become a financial burden later." The words stopped me in my tracks. I remained perfectly still. Then came the sentence I would never forget. "Honestly, Ashley, you're lucky." Imagine if his mother had money and opinions. I smiled to myself and continued walking. They thought they had figured me out. The truth was, lunch had only just begun, and so had my evaluation of them. The drive home was quiet. Daniel talked about wedding venues, guest lists, and honeymoon destinations while I watched the late afternoon sun stretch across the Texas highway. Every now and then, he glanced at me with the same hopeful expression he had worn as a little boy whenever he wanted my approval. I smiled whenever he looked my way. He deserved that much. What he did not deserve was what I was beginning to see forming around him. A few days later, Ashley invited me to join her and her mother for coffee at a cafe near downtown. I accepted immediately. When I arrived, Patricia was already seated at a corner table. She greeted me warmly, almost too warmly. The change was noticeable. During lunch, she had evaluated me. Now she seemed to be managing me. The distinction mattered. Ashley spent most of the conversation discussing wedding plans. Patricia kept steering the discussion elsewhere. She asked whether I planned to downsize my home. She asked whether Daniel handled my finances. She even asked whether I had considered moving into a retirement community someday. Every question was wrapped in concern. Every question pointed in the same direction. I answered politely. Simple answers. Small answers. Harmless answers. The more modest I appeared, the more comfortable Patricia became. By the time our coffee cups were empty, she was practically speaking freely. "Young couples need space to build their own lives," she said. "Sometimes parents have trouble letting go." I nodded thoughtfully. "That is true," I replied. Fortunately, I have always valued independence. The relief that crossed her face lasted only a second. but I saw it. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Yet over the following weeks, little details began collecting in my mind. Ashley became unusually interested in Daniel's salary. Patricia frequently asked about wedding expenses. Brandon often joked about marrying into money, then laughed as though it were harmless humor. None of these moments were serious by themselves. Together, they painted a picture. One evening, Daniel stopped by my house after work. We sat on the back patio watching the sunset turn the sky orange and gold. He looked happy. Genuinely happy. It reminded me of how difficult this situation could become if I was wrong. "Ashley is wonderful, Mom," he said. "She really cares about family." I looked at my son and felt a familiar ache. Good people often assume everyone else is operating from the same place of honesty. "I hope so," I said softly. "That matters more than anything." A week later, the first real crack appeared. It happened by accident. Ashley had left her phone on the restaurant table while she stepped away to take a call from a wedding vendor outside. The screen lit up beside me. I was not trying to read it. I simply looked up when the notification appeared. The message preview was from Patricia. It contained only one sentence. "Make sure Daniel signs nothing until we know exactly what his mother owns." I looked away immediately. When Ashley returned, I said nothing. I smiled. I finished my meal. I wished her a pleasant evening. But on the drive home, I realized something important. They were no longer trying to figure out who I was. They were trying to figure out what I had. For the next several days, I could not stop thinking about that message. Not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed something I had been sensing since the first lunch. The Carter family viewed relationships as transactions. Every conversation seemed to circle back to status, assets, or advantage. What troubled me most was not Patricia. People like her existed everywhere. What troubled me was Ashley. I still had not decided whether she was leading the conversation or simply following it. One Saturday afternoon, Ashley invited me to accompany her to a bridal showcase at a convention center outside Dallas. Hundreds of vendors filled the building. Florists, photographers, caterers, and wedding planners lined long rows beneath bright lights. Ashley appeared excited, moving from booth to booth while collecting brochures. For a while, everything felt normal. Then we stopped at a display featuring luxury honeymoon packages. The representative described several destinations and estimated costs. Ashley smiled politely, but as soon as the representative walked away, her expression changed. "Some people spend more on a honeymoon than most families earn in a year," she said. I laughed softly. "People value different things." She glanced at me. "I suppose that is easier when money is not a concern." It was a simple statement. Yet it felt like another probe. Another test. I answered exactly as expected. "I have always believed happiness costs less than people think." Ashley smiled, though the smile did not quite reach her eyes. Later that day, while she stepped away to speak with a wedding coordinator, I found a quiet place to sit near the entrance. A few minutes later, I noticed Patricia approaching from the opposite side of the hall. She had not seen me. She was speaking on her phone. Her voice carried farther than she realized. "No, we still do not know," she said. "Daniel earns enough, but the mother is the question. Ashley thinks there is something she is hiding." I lowered my eyes to a brochure in my lap. Patricia continued walking. "Exactly. Nobody lives that simply unless there is a reason." Then she disappeared into the crowd. I remained seated for several minutes after she left. Not because I was upset. Because I was thinking. They had begun with assumptions. Then curiosity. Now curiosity had become investigation. That progression mattered. That evening, I returned home and unlocked the front door of the house I had deliberately allowed them to underestimate. The rooms were quiet. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. I made myself a cup of tea and sat beside the window overlooking the backyard. My late husband used to say that people reveal their character when they believe there is nothing to gain from being kind. I thought about those words often. Especially now. Just before bedtime, my phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice sounded lighter than it had in weeks. "Mom, I have great news," he said. "Ashley and I are planning an engagement party next month. Her family wants everyone together." I congratulated him warmly. We talked for a few minutes before ending the call. Afterward, I placed the phone on the kitchen counter and stood quietly in the darkness. An engagement party meant more conversations, more opportunities, more truth. And for the first time, I had the feeling that someone in the Carter family was becoming impatient. The engagement party was scheduled for a Saturday evening at an upscale event venue overlooking a small lake north of Dallas. Daniel sounded excited every time he mentioned it. He talked about the guest list, the decorations, and the future he was building. Listening to him reminded me of the years when life still seemed simple. I wanted to protect that optimism. At the same time, I knew that protecting someone sometimes meant allowing the truth to reveal itself. During the weeks leading up to the party, I kept my routine unchanged. I drove the same old sedan. I wore the same modest clothes. I continued playing the role everyone expected. The more ordinary I appeared, the more relaxed the Carter family became. Patricia especially seemed to lose all caution. One afternoon, she invited me to lunch at a quiet restaurant. Her friendliness had become almost theatrical. Throughout the meal, she spoke about family values, financial responsibility, and planning for the future. Then she casually asked whether I had ever considered transferring any assets to Daniel before retirement. The question arrived so smoothly that another person might have missed its significance. I smiled and stirred my iced tea. There is not much to transfer, I said. Daniel has done much better than I ever did. Patricia nodded slowly. I could almost see the disappointment settling behind her eyes. Later that week, something unexpected happened. An old friend named Eleanor called me. We had known each other for more than 20 years. By coincidence, her nephew worked at the same accounting firm where Brandon Carter had recently started consulting. During our conversation, Eleanor mentioned hearing Brandon boast about a wealthy future in-law situation. The comment itself was vague, but it caught my attention immediately. Did he mention names? I asked. No, Eleanor replied. But he sounded very confident that someone in the family was sitting on a great deal of money. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my living room. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner. Piece by piece, the picture was becoming clearer. They did not know the facts. They only suspected them. And those suspicions were influencing every decision they made. The engagement party finally arrived. The venue sparkled with strings of warm lights reflected on the water outside. Guests mingled near tall windows while soft music played in the background. Daniel looked happier than I had seen him in years. Ashley looked beautiful and confident. Patricia moved through the room greeting guests like a politician working a crowd. Richard followed quietly behind her. Brandon spent most of the evening near the bar talking loudly. I stayed mostly to myself, observing, listening, learning. At one point, I stepped onto the outdoor terrace for fresh air. Through a partially open doorway, I heard familiar voices. Brandon was speaking with two friends. Trust me, he said. If this works out the way we think, Ashley will never have to worry about money again. One of the friends laughed. You already know what the mother has? Brandon chuckled. Not yet, but we are getting closer. I remained perfectly still for a moment. Then I quietly walked back inside. Across the room, Daniel was smiling as he thanked guests for coming. Watching him, I realized something important. The Carter family was no longer hiding what they wanted. The only question left was how far they were willing to go to get it. The morning after the engagement party, I woke before sunrise and sat on my back porch with a cup of coffee. The neighborhood was quiet. A light breeze moved through the trees, and for a few minutes I allowed myself to enjoy the peace. Then my phone buzzed with a message from Ashley. She wanted to have lunch. Just the two of us. I agreed immediately. When we met later that week, she seemed unusually attentive. She asked about my childhood, my marriage, and my life after my husband passed away. On the surface, it felt like genuine curiosity. Yet every personal question eventually drifted toward finances. Did I still own my home? Had I ever considered selling? Did I have investments? I answered carefully, offering enough truth to sound believable while revealing very little. The more vague my answers became, the harder she worked to uncover details. By the end of lunch, I noticed something I had not seen before. Ashley looked frustrated. Not angry. Frustrated. As though a puzzle refused to come together. A few days later, Daniel invited me to dinner at their apartment. Ashley prepared a beautiful meal. Candles flickered on the dining table. Soft music played in the background. Everything appeared warm and welcoming. Halfway through dinner, Daniel stepped away to answer a work call. The moment he left the room, Ashley lowered her voice. "Daniel worries about you sometimes," she said. I looked up. "Does he?" She nodded sympathetically. "He wants to make sure you will be comfortable in the future. Medical expenses can become overwhelming at your age." The statement was polite. The timing was not. I smiled gently. That is kind of him. Ashley leaned forward. "Have you made arrangements for your estate?" There it was. Direct. No longer hidden beneath small talk or casual curiosity. I took a sip of water before answering. There is not much to arrange. For the first time, I saw disappointment flash openly across her face. Daniel returned moments later, unaware that anything unusual had happened. The conversation shifted, and the evening continued. But something had changed. The questions were becoming bolder. The patience was fading. The following weekend, Patricia hosted a family barbecue at her home. Guests filled the backyard. Children played near the fence while adults gathered beneath a covered patio. I spent most of the afternoon observing. At one point, I walked inside to refill my drink. As I passed the hallway leading toward the kitchen, I heard voices coming from a nearby room. Patricia was speaking quietly with Richard and Brandon. "If she really has nothing, we need to know before the wedding," Patricia said. Brandon replied, "Ashley says there are too many things that do not add up." Richard remained silent for several seconds before saying, "Then find out." I continued walking without making a sound. Outside, laughter filled the backyard. Plates clattered. Music drifted through the warm Texas air. Yet all I could think about was one simple realization. They were no longer investigating out of curiosity. They had made my finances part of their plan. And for the first time, I began to wonder what they would do if they finally discovered the truth. Over the next 2 weeks, I decided to stop waiting for answers and start creating opportunities for people to reveal themselves. I never asked direct questions. I never confronted anyone. Instead, I paid attention. People often tell you everything when they believe you already agree with them. One afternoon, Ashley called and asked whether I would like to go shopping with her for wedding decorations. I accepted. We spent several hours walking through large home decor stores, comparing centerpieces, table settings, and floral arrangements. At first, the conversation remained light. Then, somewhere between the lighting aisle and the wedding displays, Ashley casually mentioned prenuptial agreements. "A lot of couples are signing them these days," she said. "It protects everyone." I nodded. "That makes sense." She glanced at me. "Do you think Daniel would ever want one?" The question seemed innocent enough. Yet something about her tone felt rehearsed. "That would be a decision for the two of them," I replied. Ashley smiled politely, but I could tell my answer had not helped her. Later that evening, I received a call from Daniel. He sounded uncomfortable. Not upset. Just uneasy. "Mom, can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." There was a brief silence. Ashley mentioned that her parents think we should talk to an attorney before the wedding, just to organize everything properly. I stared out the kitchen window while listening. "And how do you feel about that?" I asked. "Honestly, I never thought much about it before." His voice softened. "It seems important to them." After we ended the call, I sat quietly at the kitchen table for a long time. The conversation itself was not alarming. What interested me was the timing. Until now, the Carter family had been trying to discover what I owned. Suddenly, they were talking about legal protections. It felt as though they were preparing for multiple possibilities. A few days later, another piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly. My attorney, Robert Hayes, called regarding an unrelated business matter. During our conversation, he mentioned that someone had recently attempted to obtain publicly available property records connected to my name. Normally, that would not have attracted attention. The unusual part was that the request had come through several different searches over a short period of time. "Probably nothing," Robert said. but I thought you should know." I thanked him and ended the call. Then I smiled. For months, I had been watching the Carter family search for information. Now I knew the search had become far more serious. They were not guessing anymore. They were actively investigating. The following weekend, Daniel invited me to dinner again. The evening started pleasantly enough. But halfway through the meal, Ashley brought out a folder. She placed it gently on the table as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "My parents thought this might be helpful," she said. Daniel looked surprised. So did I, although only one of us was pretending. Ashley opened the folder and slid several pages across the table. They were financial planning documents, estate planning summaries, asset protection recommendations. Nothing inappropriate, nothing aggressive. Yet every page pointed toward the same subject: money, future wealth, ownership. Daniel flipped through the papers with visible confusion. Ashley watched both of us carefully. And in that moment, I realized the next move would not belong to me. It would belong to them. Daniel set the folder aside and forced a smile, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He had always been straightforward. He believed people meant what they said. That was one of the things I loved most about him. It was also what worried me now. The dinner ended politely, and I drove home through the quiet evening streets thinking about how quickly things had changed. Months earlier, the Carter family had been gathering information in whispers. Now documents were appearing on dining tables. Questions that had once been disguised as casual conversation were becoming direct. A few days later, Daniel stopped by my house unexpectedly. He arrived carrying a bag of takeout and wearing the tired expression of someone trying to solve a problem that did not make sense. We sat in the kitchen and ate while the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows. For a while we talked about work and wedding plans. Then he finally sighed and looked at me. "Mom, can I ask you something honestly?" I nodded. "Of course." He hesitated. "Do you ever feel like people judge you before they know you?" The question surprised me. Not because of the words themselves, but because it was the first sign that he was noticing what I had been seeing for months. I took a moment before answering. "Everyone gets judged sometimes," I said. "The important thing is whether someone changes their behavior after they learn the truth." Daniel stared down at his coffee cup. "Ashley says her parents are just trying to be responsible. But lately everything seems to come back to money." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he shook his head. "Maybe I am overthinking it." I did not correct him. Some lessons arrive more powerfully when people discover them on their own. Later that week, another unexpected piece of information found its way to me. Eleanor called again. Her nephew had attended a business networking event where Brandon happened to be present. According to him, Brandon had spent much of the evening talking about future opportunities connected to his sister's marriage. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just confidence. Too much confidence. Confidence built on expectations rather than facts. After ending the call, I sat quietly in my study. Around me were photographs from decades of hard work. Pictures from ribbon cuttings, community projects, business milestones. None of those achievements had been handed to me. Every dollar had been earned one difficult step at a time. The irony was almost amusing. The Carter family had spent months trying to uncover my financial situation, yet none of them seemed interested in understanding the person behind it. The following weekend, Ashley invited me to meet with her and a wedding planner. During the meeting, she appeared distracted. Several times I noticed her checking her phone. Eventually, she stepped outside to take a call. Through the large front windows, I could see her speaking animatedly. When she returned, her smile seemed forced. The planner continued discussing seating arrangements and guest lists, but Ashley barely listened. Something had changed. Something had happened. As the meeting ended, she gathered her things quickly and rushed toward the parking lot. Before she left, she turned and looked at me for a brief moment. There was no frustration in her expression this time. There was concern. Real concern. And for the first time since this entire situation began, I had the distinct feeling that someone in the Carter family had finally discovered a piece of the truth. 3 days after the meeting with the wedding planner, I received an invitation to a family dinner at Patricia and Richard's house. According to Ashley, it was simply a chance for both families to spend time together before the wedding. The moment I arrived, however, I sensed something different. The atmosphere felt unusually formal. Everyone seemed to be watching everyone else. Patricia greeted me warmly, but her smile appeared strained. Brandon barely spoke. Richard spent most of the evening staring into his drink. Only Daniel seemed unaware of the tension hanging over the room. We gathered around a large dining table covered with expensive place settings and carefully arranged centerpieces. The conversation started normally. Wedding plans, travel arrangements, future housing options. Then Patricia steered the discussion toward financial topics once again. This time she did not bother disguising it. She spoke about inheritance planning, family wealth, and the importance of transparency between relatives. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ashley remained silent. I noticed her avoiding eye contact with her mother. That alone told me more than words could have. As dinner continued, Brandon suddenly mentioned a real estate development project on the north side of Dallas. The location happened to be one of several areas where my company's owned property. The detail was obscure enough that most people would not recognize it. Yet the moment he named the area, Patricia glanced at Ashley. Ashley immediately looked down at her plate. The exchange lasted less than a second. It was enough. Someone had discovered something. The question was how much. A little later, while dessert was being served, Patricia raised her glass and offered a toast. She spoke about family, trust, and new beginnings. Then she added something unexpected. The most important thing is knowing people for who they truly are. Her eyes settled on me as she spoke. The room grew quiet. Daniel looked confused. Ashley looked nervous. I simply smiled and thanked her for the kind words. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but the tension never disappeared. When the dinner finally ended, Ashley walked me to my car. The night air was cool, and for several moments neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me. "Margaret," she said quietly, "have you ever hidden part of yourself because you wanted to know whether people cared about you or about something else?" I looked at her carefully. There was no accusation in her voice, only uncertainty. "Sometimes," I replied, "the truth reveals itself faster when people think they already know the answer." Ashley nodded slowly. She seemed about to say something more, but stopped herself. Instead, she wished me good night and walked back toward the house. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the front window, I could see Patricia speaking urgently to Brandon while Richard stood nearby. Whatever information they had uncovered, it had not satisfied them. It had only made them more determined. And for the first time, I began to suspect that the final confrontation was much closer than any of us realized. The final piece fell into place 2 weeks before the wedding. Daniel called and asked whether I would attend a small gathering at a private event room downtown. He explained that both families would be there along with a few close friends. His voice sounded hopeful, but beneath it I detected anxiety. Something was weighing on him. When I arrived that evening, the atmosphere felt strangely formal. Patricia and Brandon were already seated near the front of the room. Richard looked uncomfortable. Ashley sat quietly beside Daniel, her hands folded in her lap. After everyone settled into their seats, Patricia stood and cleared her throat. She spoke about honesty, transparency, and the importance of entering marriage without secrets. Then she looked directly at me. "There have been questions," she said carefully. "Questions that should probably be answered before this family moves forward." The room became silent. Daniel looked confused. Ashley lowered her eyes. Patricia continued. She explained that certain property records, business registrations, and public filings had raised concerns. She never directly accused me of anything, but her meaning was obvious. She wanted answers. Brandon stepped in next. He mentioned companies connected to my name. Land holdings, investments, corporate records. As he spoke, I noticed the confidence in his voice begin to weaken. He had facts, but not the full story. When he finally stopped speaking, every eye in the room turned toward me. For several seconds, I said nothing. Then I smiled. "You are correct," I said. "I did not tell you everything." Daniel stared at me. Patricia leaned forward. Brandon looked almost triumphant. I reached into my handbag and removed a folder. Inside were documents prepared months earlier by my attorney. I handed copies to Daniel first, then Ashley, then the others. The room remained silent as pages turned. Corporate ownership records, trust documents, business summaries. Decades of work reduced to neat stacks of paper. The expressions around the room changed one by one. Surprise, confusion, disbelief. Richard was the first to speak. "You own all of this?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I replied. Daniel looked up from the documents. "Mom?" I nodded gently. "Your father and I built the foundation. I spent the last 20 years growing it." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Ashley did something I did not expect. She looked directly at me and said, "You knew what my family was doing, did not you?" I smiled softly. I suspected. Patricia looked embarrassed for the first time since I had met her. Brandon could not meet my eyes. Daniel slowly set the papers down and looked around the room. Understanding settled across his face. Not anger. Understanding. The kind that arrives when 100 small moments suddenly make sense. Ashley reached for his hand. He took it, but his attention remained fixed on the people around him. In that moment, nobody was thinking about money anymore. They were thinking about trust. As the evening came to an end, I gathered my things and prepared to leave. Before I walked out, Ashley stopped me near the door. "I am sorry," she said quietly. I studied her face and saw something I had not seen before. Honesty. Real honesty. I nodded once. "The truth has a way of arriving eventually," I said. Then I stepped outside into the cool evening air, leaving behind a room full of people who finally understood that the most valuable thing I had protected was never my wealth. It was the chance to learn who they truly were.